it's changing the gender roles. We talked about that the day before yesterday. That's creating this sense of the home and the workplace being separate, and this idea of separate spheres and more of a concept of what was the man's world and what was a woman's world and all of that. But it also means, there's kind of a whole new way that people are making a living. And that is both good and bad. There are plus sides and there are downsides to that. While industrialization definitely provides a lot of people an opportunity to make money, an opportunity to be successful, an opportunity to be inventive, to use their entrepreneurship, to use their know-how and their skills to become quite wealthy, having not been born into that, it of course changes the very nature of work itself, and it creates, yes, a class of what we might call industrial capitalists, people that are able to, invest at the right time, to start a business at the right time and start a new product and make something of themselves. It does provide that, but it also creates this class of industrial laborers that as industrialization grows, becomes more and more of an oppressed sort of a group, and people that are going to find themselves more and more in a disadvantaged position, and find that factory work very stifling and very brutal, and start seeing demanding changes because of that. So it just changes the very nature of how people work, how people make a living, in more people going to a workplace, working for a wage, factory work, but factory work starts to change and evolve as well as industrialization continues to grow. So, something that all this leads to, and it's partially because of industrialization as well as other factors, what we're seeing in this period, in the North mainly, is something called urbanization. Urbanization, what is urban? If a place or an area is urban, towns, cities, okay? Urbanization means the growth of urban areas, the growth of cities, the growth of larger towns, and more people moving to those cities and larger towns. And that, of course, is happening here, again, mainly in the North, in the early 19th century, partially because of industrialization. Why would more people be moving and living in the towns and cities? Yeah, jobs, right? Because industrialization means that's where the jobs are. People are leaving the farm, they're leaving the rural areas and moving to cities in order to seek factory jobs. Now, at this point, and for a long time, even after this, we're still not to where most Americans live in cities. Most Americans did still live in rural areas, and that's going to be the case into the 20th century. However, it is still, you are seeing a big shift, something that is very sizable and important to note. More people are living in those cities than did before, although, again, most people still live in the rural areas. So you're seeing the growth of existing cities, some of them that have been around for a long time, places like New York, of course, Buffalo, Detroit, Chicago, and you're seeing other places that may have not have existed, or that may have just been little small backwoods towns prior to industrialization starting to spring up. So it's mostly in the north and in the northwest, but you're seeing increasing migration to the cities, mainly because of jobs. That is also happening in combination with a massive wave of immigration that the United States is experiencing at this point. Now, immigration, of course, is a constant factor. There's always been immigration to the United States. There's rarely points where it drops off completely. We'll talk later about points where it goes to a trickle, but it never completely stops. So it was something, that wasn't new, but what we see happen about the 1830s until probably sometime in the 1850s is immigration from Europe just kind of explodes. There's this massive wave of immigration. Immigration to the United States prior to this, it had existed, of course, but it had been very, very slow. There were lots of different reasons for that. There just wasn't near as much motivation for Europeans as there would be later on. The War of 1812 had slowed it down. The Napoleonic Wars and other kind of things in Europe had slowed it down and not meant that there were all kinds of restrictions and other sort of things that were preventing Europeans from immigrating. But that starts to pick up once the War of 1812 is over and the Napoleonic Wars are over and all of that. So you're starting to see a slight increase in immigration after that. But then after somewhere in the 1830s, about mid 1830s, that's where it just explodes because there's this, for one thing, there's a number of reasons. But there's a worldwide economic slump. There's an economic crisis, or what we might today call a depression, or something like that, that hit certain European countries particularly hard. And so that leads to, between mid 1830s and about 1850 or so, just a huge swell, a huge increase, a big influx of immigrants to the United States. As you can see, this graph here shows you some numbers. You see that it's not very many, and then all of a sudden, just right there, it just shoots up out of nowhere, it seems. Now, immigrants, one of the odd things, and we'll talk about immigration a lot, it'll keep coming up, but one of the great ironies, perhaps, of this country is that we are a nation of immigrants that has never liked immigrants all that much. And so those immigrants are going to experience a great deal of challenges and a lot of discrimination and a lot of restrictions and, of course, an ugly reaction. They're not always, and oftentimes not, very welcomed when they arrive to the United States. Now, of these immigrants that are arriving in the United States between these years, the largest group of them were Irish. So if you broke down the different numbers that were coming, overwhelmingly, the largest percentage of them were Irish immigrants. They probably accounted for maybe about half. I can't remember quite the percentages, but at least maybe a third or something like that. But if you broke down the nationalities, there were more Irish immigrants than anything. And many of you may remember from world history what was a big factor that led a lot of Irish immigrants in particular to come to the United States. Famine, yes. I mentioned the economic downturn that had affected a lot of people, and that had particularly devastated places like Ireland. And I know sometimes, for some reason, the Great Potato Famine kind of becomes, I don't know, kind of comical sounding, but it wasn't. Imagine people starving to death because there was no food, and that was the reality for those people. And thousands of people died, and so they were fleeing that hunger and fleeing that devastation. They had been a prolonged depression in Ireland, not just because of that potato famine, that just added to their problems, because they had been in prolonged depression for quite some time. They were ravaged by economic collapse. And that potato famine, like I said, that killed like 1 million people. I mean, it's not, it wasn't just a little thing. Irish immigrants were a huge number, and probably not quite half, but more than a quarter, I think, of immigrants coming to the United States at this period. Irish immigrants tended to be, generally speaking, and can't really, you're not saying for all of them, but generally speaking, Irish people tended to be quite poor. We know that's one of the big reasons why they came to the United States, why they fled Ireland, was to flee poverty and to flee economic depression and no economic opportunities. So they came poor, destitute. They weren't able, they had no money, so they weren't able to go and buy a farm somewhere. They weren't able to move out west and get land or any of those things. So where did these people end up? In the cities, that's right. So that's another big reason for the increase in urbanization. Some of that is, inward migration, people, internal migration of people moving to the cities. And a lot of it has to do with the major influx of immigrants. Large numbers of Irish immigrants tend to congregate in these cities, one for community and familiarity, to be around people that were, where they had more of a sense of a cultural similarity and identity. But a lot of it's also because they were poor and really had nowhere else to go, and no other real options. And so many of those jobs, those industrial jobs, will be filled by Irish laborers going to work in the factories, which causes, one of the reasons for a lot of the tension. So particularly in your northeastern cities is where Irish immigrants will tend to congregate a lot. Now, this leads, of course, to a reaction from the American public, which is not A positive one. Again, one of the great ironies of this country is that we are a nation of immigrants that have not ever liked immigrants and has oftentimes been quite hostile towards immigrants. And so it leads to a movement that is particularly pronounced in the North where there was more immigration, a movement called nativism. Nativism, or a nativist, this was a hostility toward immigrants. Hostility or prejudice, dislike, anger, or outright hatred even of immigrants. People were nativists, they didn't like immigrants, or they wanted to limit immigrants or something along those lines. Nativism, what does the first part of that word look like? Native. They would have called themselves Native Americans. Now, by saying that, they're not talking about what we would consider Native Americans, American Indians. They meant native born, as in born in the United States, people that were not immigrants, people that probably were the children of immigrants, or at least the grandchildren of immigrants, but people that were native born. So nativists did not like immigrants, distrusted immigrants. What do you think were some of the reasons why they were opposed to immigrants and immigration? Big thing was job competition. That was oftentimes one of the big reasons that they would argue that immigrants were needed to be limited or whatever. They feared competition for jobs. And it was true that a lot of immigrants were seeking jobs, and it was also true that oftentimes they would work for lower pay and for less money. And so there was concern that not only were they taking jobs, but they were driving wages down and keeping wages low. They're what now? They're foreign. Okay, what do you mean by foreign?
Like they're not from.
And therefore what? They're enemies, they're different, they're can't be trusted. What were you going to say? Yeah, they would see, particularly in reference to the Irish, that they're crowding places. There's too many of them. They're crowding the cities. And it's all just a bunch of poor people, and they're bringing over crime, and they're bringing over, drunkenness and all these sorts of things. So it's not just economic concerns, but social concerns. And yes, this idea that they couldn't be Americanized, that they were too different, that they were, unlike America, their culture, their customs, and all of that couldn't be absorbed into the United States. So nativists had a multitude of reasons why they would have disliked immigrants. Now, I didn't put them up here, but next to Irish immigrants, the next biggest group was German immigrants. They probably made up the next to largest group. German immigrants, although they do experience nativism, the Irish bear the brunt of it more than anybody. For one thing, they were the largest group. German immigrants, however, tend to be a bit more financially secure. They tend to be a bit more financially well off. There were plenty of poor German immigrants. So they tend to be wealthier. Not that they're just a bunch of rich people, but they tended to have more money. They tended to have more education. There tended to be more skilled professionals amongst German immigrants. So they were far less likely. One, they're not coming over in quite as big numbers. They were quite big, but not near as big as the Irish. But they were more likely to be able to purchase a farm somewhere out, in Minnesota or something. They were far more likely to not congregate in cities, in poor areas, and slums and things like that. So while they do experience some discrimination, the Irish bear that burden the most. And the other thing about the Irish immigrants that really, really gets the nativists riled up, what probably is one of their number one complaints about Irish immigrants and what is so much at the heart of the nativist movement has to do with religion. What religion do you think most Irish immigrants were? They were Catholic. And that is a huge part of the nativist movement. So much of the nativist movement was an anti-Catholic movement. And there was a just ridiculous but great concern that all of this immigration was some kind of a Catholic conspiracy. That this was sort of like a conspiracy by the Catholic Church, by the Vatican, by the Pope, to take influence and all that sort of stuff. Catholics, of course, have been in the United States since the colonial period, but they've always been a minority. And so when this big influx of poor Irish Catholic immigrants comes in, a lot of people found that as very alarming. So nativism becomes a quite sizable movement, particularly again in your northern areas and your western areas, in urban areas where immigration was far more prevalent than it was in some places. For example, you won't see too much nativist activity, say in the South, because that's not where a lot of the immigration was taking place. Most immigrants weren't moving to the South. There were some, but not near as much as what you see in those northeastern cities. Now, nativism, it becomes more than just an attitude. It becomes more than just sort of an interest. It eventually even works its way into politics. And different groups in society start to form around these nativist ideas. Starting out with just, interest, what we might call an interest group today, societies and so forth dedicated to trying to block immigration or to restrict the rights of immigrants, things like that. And eventually that even organizes into political parties. And so we have somewhere in the 1840s or so the formation of what becomes called the American Party. This is a political party that is based on nativist principles. They are centered around an anti-immigration platform. Now, this is, not replacing Democrats or Whigs or whichever ones happen to be present at the time. This is an additional party that we see spring up every now and again. But the American Party was based on these nativist, anti-immigration principles. Why do you suppose they called themselves the American Party? Yeah, they're trying to say we're the real Americans and we're trying to protect America from these people that are not Americans and can't be Americans, and we're trying to preserve America, this and that. Yeah, it kind of tries to invoke this very patriotic, and that's how they argued, how they felt about a lot of this. So the American Party, you would have seen them, again, they would have had more presence and they would have been more successful in the North and in some Western cities. You wouldn't have seen the American Party be too active in places like the South where they didn't have tons of immigration. But the more immigration, the more support the American Party is going to get. And while, no, it's not going to be, a hugely successful national party, you're not going to see them win presidential elections and stuff, but the American Party would have success, at the state level, at city level, those kinds of things. American Party would have supported, any kind of restrictions on immigration, limitations on immigration, which you won't see that happen at the national level at this point, but that's something that the American Party would have supported. A lot of the time, it's rules and things to limit immigrants once they arrive in the United States. Some of them wanted laws to say people or immigrants couldn't hold office once they became voters and once they became, integrated into society. Wanted to take that away from them, or they didn't allow them. There was discrimination in jobs, there was discrimination in housing, there was discrimination in all kinds of places, and they would have supported, legal means to enforce that kind of discrimination. Now, the American Party also goes by a nickname that we need to know. They're also called the Know Nothings. So the American Party, the Know Nothings, that's the same group. They're called the Know Nothing sometimes because the American Party, before it organized into an official political party, it was originally sort of like I said, kind of an interest group, a secret society. And it was called the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, again, trying to invoke these memories or these concepts of patriotism and preserving America and all this kind of business. But since they were a secret society and they didn't go around advertising about their meetings or their activities or memberships and those kind of things, the story went that if you asked someone that was involved, what do y'all do? What's going on? When's the next meeting? What are y'all up to these days? What would they reply? I know nothing. So because it was originally kind of a secretive thing and they didn't disclose any information, people start calling them the Know Nothing, since that was their answer all the time to the questions about their activity. So the Know Nothings is not necessarily a comment on their intelligence, but over their secrecy, at least in the early days of it. So the nativist movement becomes particularly strong because in this time, because of the high number of immigrants coming in. again. And then you'll see this nativist, it never ever goes away, but we'll see it kind of resurge when we'll see a second surge of immigration happen after the Civil War, and then again, we'll see it come back in the 1920s and so forth. So you never see this go away. The American Party, however, you won't see it forever, but the whole concept of nativism and this idea that immigrants were un-American or they couldn't be Americanized or that native-born Americans were somehow better, that never really goes away. Again, one of the big arguments that the nativists use is this: immigrants are taking jobs, immigrants are unfair competition in the workplace, immigrants are driving wages down. So let's look at the workplace and what some of the other problems in the workplace were and how people start to organize to change those kinds of things. So we know that industrialization completely changes the way people work and the way people earn a living, meaning that a lot of people are now working off of the farm and in factory jobs. And at first, this may have been a very empowering thing. There is a lot of evidence to suggest when industrialization first got off the ground in the United States, they were very small industries. They were what you'd call cottage-based industries. And it does seem to indicate that a lot of the time there was, a smaller workforce. There was more of a sense that workers were kind of part of the group, that employers kind of owed something to their workers, that they were responsible for them, that they should provide a fair wage, that they provide housing, all those kind of things. We saw that we read something about the Massachusetts mills, the Lowell mills, and we read one account that kind of described that, about the girls there having proper housing and, getting enough to eat and nice clothing and medical care and all those kind of things. That's not untrue. We know that probably was the case, at least early on. But as time goes on and as those factories get bigger and big businesses get bigger and there's more and more profits to be made, we will soon see those employers, the factory owners, people that own the businesses, starting to put profits ahead of their workers' welfare and ahead of their workers' well-being. And so that creates some ugly situations for industrial laborers. Industrial laborers, of course, are the people working in these factories, people working in these kinds of industrial jobs. And again, they, at first, in the earliest days of industrialization, industrial laborers probably were better taken care of. There was more of a sense of responsibility to those workers, and so forth. But as time goes on, we see that less and less. And those industrial laborers start to be seen as more expendable and, people that could easily be replaced. Because one thing about these industrial laborers that industrialization does is it means, a decrease in skilled work and a higher number of unskilled laborers. What's the difference between skilled labor and unskilled labor?
Skilled is talking about a specific thing, not unskilled. They don't really know.
Yeah. What are you gonna? Right. So skilled labor is something more specific, and it requires specific training and specific education that probably took years. That's something like a carpenter or a blacksmith or someone that has been apprenticed to a master craftsman, and they worked on it throughout their life. But not anybody can just come off the street and use their skills to build furniture or something. That takes a lot of training. Unskilled labor does not require specific skills. And it doesn't require a whole lot of education. You might need a little bit of on-the-job training, but typically speaking, it's generally considered something that just about anybody can do. Or rather that it doesn't require some kind of long-term education or long-term training. And these industrial laborers are more and more unskilled workers because industrialization meant you didn't need as many skilled people. These are unskilled workers. So because they're unskilled, they're seen as expendable. They're easy to replace. Why pay them a whole lot of money when you've got 1,500 other people that are ready to do the job for lower pay or for barely anything at all? So we know that these factory workers, these industrial laborers, experienced a lot of tension and a lot of suffering because of the fact that they weren't seen as, people that needed to be appeased or pacified or taken care of, and they were expendable. So what are some of the problems, that these factory workers faced? Bad conditions, yes. Terrible conditions, and that will get worse and worse because there were no rules or laws here saying that the workplace had to be safe. So these machinery and stuff could be quite dangerous, and they're operating stuff without any sort of rules about safety standards or safety training or anything like that. So injuries on the job could be quite common. Also sanitation, this was before there were any rules about that. So there were no rules about cleanliness or ventilation. And so sometimes they're in these just, shut up rooms. And I think that was described in one of the documents we read that showed us another vision of the Lowell mills, and that the air was not clean and it was hard to breathe. Yes. Overworked, yes. They work long, long hours, sometimes 10, 11, 12, maybe even 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. There were no laws about how much a person could work before they at least had to be paid, overtime or something. Nothing like that. So they could just be working. And a lot of people, because of wages, felt they had no choice but to work that much in order to try to make ends meet.
Just overall
Neglect of health, yes. Like we said, there's no rules about sanitation or cleanliness. And, there's nothing about providing health care or anything like that to workers. So disease was very much a problem, or, people aging very prematurely or dealing with diseases or injuries that were the result of their work in the factories. And if you got sick because of exposure to something on the job, or your arm got mangled in a machine, or something, arm chopped off or something, what happened to you? You can't work anymore, can you? There's no workman's comp. There's no, paying you or giving you a pension or anything like that to pay you for your work. Yeah, generally mistreated. If they don't make their quota or they don't do something right, who knows what would happen. Child labor, of course. We read the account we were reading, even the nice one, even the one that portrayed it as a nice place. Those were still, girls of, your age or younger. And we know that children much younger than that, were employed in factories. And sometimes employers preferred that because they were smaller and they could get inside the machines and, more agile and stuff like that. And you didn't have to pay them as much. And there were no laws about that. What about wages?
just
Almost nothing. Yeah, they're unskilled workers, so the wages go down. At the same time, their benefits aren't going up, so they're barely making enough to get by. So incredibly low wages, incredibly bad conditions, long hours, poor health. These are things that these workers will continually struggle with. And so it's not surprising that pretty early on, workers will start trying to organize and start trying to work together to try to bring about change. Because again, because of the fact that they're unskilled, they found it rather difficult for just one person to go and ask for a raise or ask for, shorter hours or something like that. They would have been, laughed out of the office or fired or something like that. And so early on, workers realized that their best option is to work together, strengthen numbers, to work together as a group to demand those things. So they began forming pretty early on labor unions. So labor unions are just that. It is organizations of workers, workers coming together to form groups to seek change and to try to bargain with their employers for things like increased wages or better housing, or maybe they want a school built in the company town for their children to go to school, or maybe they just want one day off a week or something like that. Now, labor unions at first would have been very, very small. They would have been based probably just in a particular factory or a particular industry, just that handful of workers in that particular place. But as time goes on, we see these get bigger and bigger. And then later in the later part of the 19th century, you'll see them start going national. But at first, they're pretty small. Now, labor unions and the plight of labor, the whole mission for labor to accomplish some of those things that we just talked about, this is a long, 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 difficult road. And labor unions will not really get any permanent, lasting change at the national level and really not into the 20th century. So this is a long way that they've got to come. Now, labor unions utilize a variety of tactics. You know, a lot of times it's just negotiating and trying to talk with their employers, which sometimes the employers will not do. Now, one of the tactics that probably comes to mind when we think about labor unions is the use of strikes, and that does happen quite often. What is a strike if workers are going on strike? You know, there's a way of protesting. What do you do when you go on strike? Huh? Refuse to work, right? Saying we're not going to work until we get a raise. We're not going to work until you give us one day off a week to rest or something like that. Now, we typically think of strikes happening being like the number one tactic. It usually isn't. And the thing is that strikes were hardly ever successful, certainly not in this period. Striking was one of the least effective forms of labor union activity for a long, 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 long time. And this brings up not only why the strikes were not very successful, but why labor unions were struggling so hard in this period. Because for one, mainly for strikes, you know, why would it be easy for employers to get around a strike? They just fire them and hire somebody else. Again, these are unskilled workers; they're expendable. So it was very, very easy for that employer to get their factory back working again by hiring somebody else in place. Those replacement workers, those strike breakers, become called scabs. The scabs were strike breakers. So these would be the employees that they would hire to get the factory moving again and break a strike. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time, scabs tend to be immigrants. We talked about them a moment ago, because immigrants tended to be willing to work for lower wages. And so oftentimes they would be utilized by employers as scabs, thus part of the anti-immigration movement. And this is a struggle. One of the big problems for the labor movement in general is it tends to be very divided. They fail to be able to overcome some of their internal differences. Labor unions tend to be anti-immigrants, you see, and then later you get some that will say, no, we need to be including the immigrants, you know, and so there's this whole division over who they should be including in their union and who they should not be including. And sometimes that's a difference over immigration. It's a difference over skilled and unskilled workers. You have that whole thing. You'll have differences over do we include men and women, racial differences. That is constantly going to be something that plagues labor unions is their often inability to overcome that kind of stuff and all really and truly stand together. They tend to be divided amongst themselves. But it's not just that strikes themselves don't work why labor unions really, really struggle for such a long time. You know, oftentimes unions themselves, part of what unions are fighting for a long time, in addition to better wages and all that stuff, is simply the right to exist, the right to be a union, and the right to be involved in a union if one chose to be. Because what happens a lot in this period is that a lot of times strikes or just any kind of union activity would be declared illegal. You know, courts would say that unions were an illegal conspiracy and they could not exist, and or say that employers didn't have to deal with unions. They did not have to negotiate with unions. They could say, I don't deal with unions, I don't hire union workers, whatever. So they could easily just get around it all. So for a long time, that's something that unions are up against, is not just this division within themselves, you know, legal injunctions, laws at the state level, at the local level that prevented them from really having any kind of a voice of saying that they were a legal entity, that striking was, you know, a legal situation, all sorts of stuff. And that's something, like I said, you'll continue to look at and see some strikes that really get out of hand. Oftentimes strikes are ended violently. Sometimes it's not just a matter of you putting scabs in place. Sometimes private security is called out. A lot of them end quite violently. You won't see them become really violent until after the Civil War, but you'll see some big strikes later on that became quite ugly. So like I said, this is a long, long way that labor unions have got to go. And it's one of those things also, it's like every once in a while they'll kind of take a couple of steps forward for a little while and then sort of move back. But it's still something, really. Labor unions today, not near as strong as they were about mid 20th century, but still a presence and still fighting for some of those same things even now. Okay, so we will continue to look at that, but once again, these are things that are particularly happening in those northern states. This is something that in the South that wasn't industrialized and wasn't, experiencing a great deal of immigration, something that would not have been high on their minds or at the front of their agenda for what they thought was important or what was a problem that needed to be addressed. All right.